Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. From short fronting to shoal chivalry, international politics this week has been full of gestures, big and small. How much should we read into them? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Jeff Beatty, an acclaimed psychologist specializing in nonverbal communication and body language. Dr. Beatty, thank you very much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Now, as we speak, the G20 summit in Australia is drawing to a close, and on the eve of this meeting, there had been quite a controversy on whether the Russian President Vladimir Putin should be allowed to attend. I mean, the host country, Australia, had significant objections, but at the end they had to acquiesce, even though Prime Minister Tony Abbott did promise to, quote, short front Mr. Putin. And this is not your typical dry diplomatic language. It's quite suggestive, I think, in terms of psychology, and it's quite a loaded metaphor. I wonder, what does it convey to you?
Well, it is a loaded metaphor, and I have to confess I didn't actually know what it meant. I knew it was either from American rules football or from rugby, and I think it means something different in both of those. But either way, I think it's quite a confrontational metaphor. And I think it was an attempt to appeal to the Australian people, who, of course, like direct talk. Now, of course, what's interesting is when you say that you're going to shirt front President Putin, then you better follow it through. But in terms of his body language, that's not what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as you said, the short fronting metaphor implies a certain amount of physicality and brute force. And yet from the pictures and the videos that we've seen of the two of them meeting, they both appeared quite calm and I think even relaxed in front of each other. And I guess it's all posturing, both, you know, the promise to either attack him or confront him, and the coolness as well. But what is more difficult to sort of convey, you know, this image of a tough guy or an image of a cool guy, especially in this very high-stake environment?
Well, it's a very difficult challenge, and I was interested in the images of Tony Abbott and President Putin talking, because Tony Abbott's smiling a lot, but if you look very carefully at the smile, he's baring his teeth quite a lot. And some psychologists say that the origins of the smile are actually quite aggressive, and that you can both smile at someone and be aggressive simultaneously. It's a very difficult feat to pull off intentionally. And of course, that's the really interesting thing about nonverbal communication or body language, which is so much of it's unconscious. We can try to interfere with it, but it's still telling us a great deal. And I was struck by the video footage of Tony Abbott trying to get close to President Putin in the group photograph. And again, very interesting, because I think he leaked a good deal more information than he intended to send. He wanted to put up this image of this tough guy ready to shirt front, but it wasn't quite the image that came through in terms of what happened next. It was a kind of, he was slightly embarrassed by the layout of the group. So I think there is a lot going on. It's multi-layered. People try to send the right messages, but sometimes the body language takes over.
Very interesting. Now, this week, Mr. Putin also had several brief encounters with the American President Barack Obama, and it's no secret that there is absolutely no love lost between the two of them. I mean, during the previous summits, they quite intentionally tried to avoid each other. I wonder, from the footage that you've seen so far, can you really say whether it was confrontational or more conciliatory? Because some say that even the fact of them, you know, meeting and exchanging a couple of phrases is already a good sign, given the state of international politics these days.
Well, it's extraordinary that we're so easily pleased with just a few words between people. We're reassured by that. But I think when I watch the footage of Obama and Putin together, you detect this kind of power play. I think President Putin is very aware of the iconic significance of certain images in terms of how people perceive him. And you can see that in the handshake with Obama, he's kind of gearing up to sending the right message. If you notice that his arm and hand position is much more perpendicular than Obama's, which is much more relaxed. And that allows President Putin, of course, to take the dominant hand. Whichever hand's on top, in some sense, controls the encounter. So that's a very interesting little bit of power play. He kind of pulls Obama in a little bit. There is a difference in height, so he levels it out a bit by pulling him closer, puts Obama slightly off balance. The smiles in both of them are really interesting, because Obama has got what a lot of people see as a natural smile. It is quite a natural-looking smile, but it's not as natural as it might seem. Psychologists call natural smiles Duchamp smiles. And Duchamp smiles are really interesting because they go onto the face slowly and leave the face slowly. But if you watch Obama's smiles, even when they look natural, involving both the mouth and the eyes, they often leave quite quickly and reveal his underlying emotion after it's gone. And there is a slight, very negative emotion leaked at that point in the handshake moment. So part of it is about power play. Part of it is about people trying to cover up their emotions by doing a face for the cameras. But sometimes their emotions leak out in these micro expressions. Smiles are very interesting from a psychology point of view because smiles are the biggest masks that human beings use to cover up their natural feelings towards one another. So if you want to work out what's really going on there, what you have to do is look out for the smiles, work out if it's a masking smile, watch the masking smile fade, and then watch the emotion there. And for a moment, there's a slight look of disgust on Obama's face. So there is negative emotion written all over it.
Well, and I think we also have to keep in mind that for Russians and for Americans, I mean, smiles come in differently because I think Americans are much more sort of conditioned to smile openly with, showing their teeth. And I think it's much more difficult for Russians. I mean, we are not smiley people. And many psychologists here in Russia say that if people really smile at you, they mean it. I mean, Russians don't give smiles easily. And I wonder if you saw any sign of disgust or mistrust in Putin's smile, for that matter.
Well, there is a little bit. You've made a very good point there, which is different cultures use smiles differently. And Americans are famous for two things, which is their frequency of smiles and their teeth, which they're very proud of course. They like displaying their teeth. Other countries do nevertheless manage to control their emotional displays in quite different ways. And the Russian cultural way seems to be much more about a kind of tighter control on the emotional display. But again, with President Putin, there is a slight negative look after the whole episode is finished. So, which kind of matches Obama's own, really. So at one level, here are two nations prepared to do business. Of course they have to. Of course they have to keep communicating. Of course they have to go through the normal rules that bind people together. But at another level, I think there is something about, their emotions to events that have recently happened, and they both leak those negative emotions. And you're absolutely right, in different ways. One, trying to use a masking smile to cover it up. One trying to exert more control over his general facial expression.
Now, one of your colleagues, body language expert Nick Morgan, suggested that Putin and Obama have this classic alpha male problem that, during many of their encounters, they have this dominance competition sort of leaking out or playing out in their gestures. And I wonder, though, if it's not a bit trivial or simplistic to reduce the problem to that. Surely Russia and the United States have very, very significant ideological differences, and reducing it to just these two men trying to work out who is the top dog seems to be, a bit too simplistic, as I said.
Well, I couldn't agree more. It is too simplistic to reduce politics to simply a fight between two primates for the alpha role position. That's not what politics is about. Of course, it's about a clash of ideologies. But at the same time, every politician is also a human being. And whether we like it or not, these non-verbal things that we do affect how we think about ourselves. And if one person is a top dog in Russia and one top in the US, and when you put them together, something is going to happen. And from a psychology point of view, it's fascinating to watch how they negotiate that in terms of who gets the dominant position in the handshake. There is one moment when President Putin touches President Obama on the shoulder. What kind of response do you get? Because touching someone is what powerful people do to less powerful people. And Obama looks slightly uncomfortable. Now, as a politician, you might think, this is not about me. This is not about body language. This is all about important things happening in the world. But at another level, he has to give a kind of intuitive, instinctive response to what's just been done. And that's what he does. And you can see, again, a kind of look of slight discomfort on his face. So I think that politicians, because they're also human beings and biological creatures, they do all of this stuff in addition to philosophizing and arguing about ideology.
Now, despite their obvious dislike for each other, Putin and Obama have at least one thing in common, and that is both of them certainly weren't born alpha males. I mean, if we look at their early pictures from their early adulthood, they were both a bit lanky, even a bit nerdy. It doesn't look like they were extremely popular or handsome, and well, I think it's fair to say that they both were what we call late bloomers. Would their modest beginnings make them more or less likely to prove or assert themselves?
Well, I think it's a very good question. And I think they both kind of evolved into being alpha males. You don't have to be born an alpha male to be one. And I think people work at it. And of course, you work at it by acquiring the skills and attributes that you need. And both of these politicians have spent a lifetime in doing that. You ask an interesting question. Aren't they getting to an age now where they could stop thinking about this kind of thing? Well, if your whole life and your whole life of success is based on this, then that's very, very difficult to do. And these people, of course, are still at the pinnacle of their political careers, so they can't just dispense with this stuff. And of course, the whole point is, if you're a self-made alpha male, you will rely upon some of these power plays even more, to the extent that these things are instinctive. This is what they do naturally. Obama's very good at some, for example, looking very relaxed where everyone else is very formally dressed, as a way of kind of upsetting the hierarchy, the status quo. It's only the boss who can look relaxed when everyone else is dressed up, suit, tie, and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of things that he relies upon, and the point is they have worked for him. And he's not going to give them up now. And I suspect the same with President Putin.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Beatty, I think the perception of sexuality, especially in politics, is very different across cultures. And if we take the example of Putin, in Western media, he's usually portrayed as this testosterone-driven man. We often see those pictures from, I don't know, like 7 or 8 years ago when he was once photographed bare-chested. I mean, those pictures get retranslated over and over again. And yet in Russia, I think his domestic image is very different. That testosterone energy is usually played down. He's usually shown or portrayed as, soft and caring, surrounded by children, by animals. So isn't that a fascinating example of how media on both sides, both in the West and in Russia, can essentially mold the same person into what they would like him to be or how they see it? I mean, at the end of the day, he's the same person, but he's portrayed very differently in, these different environments.
Well, I think he is the same person, but obviously the media constructs him one way or another for its own ends. And it's interesting you say that, because if you ask me to close my eyes now and imagine President Putin, it would be stripped to the waist, fishing, karate, it's all that judo, it's all that macho stuff that I imagine him doing now. And what's really interesting is trying to work out the psychological motivation behind that, because, of course, in the UK, he's normally contrasted with British politicians who you think, could you ever imagine seeing them in that kind of situation? So he is portrayed in a certain kind of way, and perhaps that's a way of trying to explain to people in the West that in some sense you have to be that kind of powerful person to rule a country like Russia. Perhaps that's part of the psychological motivation, and perhaps part of the psychological motivation is to say, and therefore we have to be tough with such an individual, because I always think that social constructions of political personalities is usually motivated by either explicit or implicit processes. And I think that you could theorize long and hard about why he's portrayed in certain ways in the West and very differently in Russia itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Beatty, we have to take a very short break now, but when we come back, is being courteous with your host's wife an act of politeness or, on the contrary, rudeness? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the body language of geopolitics with psychologist Dr. Jeff Beatty. Now, Dr. Beatty, another controversy last week involved a shawl that, the same Russian President Vladimir Putin offered to China's First Lady. And I thought that was a very fascinating example of the cultural differences between Russia, the West, and China, because, to a Russian viewer, it wasn't even an attempt at chivalry. I mean, it's a basic politeness you would expect from a man, but obviously the Chinese didn't see it this way, because I understand that they totally censored the whole episode, and I thought that perhaps was a very oriental way of reacting to an oddity, because they essentially chose to ignore it rather than express any emotions. What do you think about that?
Well, again, like yourself, I thought it was a natural kind of polite gesture. If the lady was cold, then why not offer her a shawl? But of course, her response to it was took President Putin by surprise a little bit, because you can see that it's not long before she kind of requests a coat, and it kind of left President Putin a little bit uncomfortable. And I was fascinated by his gestural movements, as if he was trying to still keep a degree of control over the encounter. Now, some critics, of course, or some observers have said the whole point about the event in the first place was that President Putin was trying to display his very close relationship with China. It was a symbolic moment. It was iconic. He was trying to represent something. I don't think that was true at all. I think what happened there was a bit of human interaction that just went a little bit awry because there are cultural differences about this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And I have seen the news that in China that tape has been edited or removed so that people can't witness this encounter. But it just shows you how the simplest and smallest bits of human behavior seem to have a significance way above themselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, if Chinese try to downplay it, I think Western media definitely tried to oversell it, because if we look at some of the Western headlines, for example, the Sydney Morning Herald announced that Putin tried to, quote, crack onto the First Lady. Slate said that he flirted with her, and Foreign Policy went with Putin hitting on China's First Lady. And I wonder if that's not yet another example of this testosterone-driven narrative that we always get about Russia in the West. And what does it really say about Western reporters when they see sexual motives in situations where there clearly aren't any? I mean, I don't think anybody seriously can believe that Putin was trying to, get the attention of the Chinese First Lady.
I think trying to attribute any sexual motives in that situation is a bit silly, really, because it had none of the other non-verbal signals of flirtation at all. It was a simple act. If you look at the eye contact, the smiling, none of it would suggest anything other than what it was. But again, in terms of why people read certain things into this, then again, perhaps there is this fear in certain countries that it is this kind of rampant macho culture that we have to be terrified of, and that any small behavior has to be interpreted in a particular way, that it's going to have this kind of significance. But I think if you go to that bit of interaction neutrally and objectively, you wouldn't kind of go for that interpretation at all. I think that is just a bit silly, to be honest.
Now, depending on your cultural norms, this Shawl incident could be interpreted as both a sign of respect and a sign of disrespect, because if, for example, President Putin attempted to do that in a Muslim country, I think he would run into much greater trouble than just, media censoring that whole incident. And I think the reasons why we haven't heard or haven't seen more gaffes or more incidents like that is because global politics is still predominantly dominated by men, and men have figured out the way of interacting among themselves. But I wonder if, as more women try to enter politics, global politics, do you think that these dynamics of personal relationship or interpersonal dynamics are going to change? Because surely there will be more controversies about whether you have to give a seat to a woman, how do you behave in a public environment. There's some tricky questions to be resolved, I guess, especially when people come from different cultural backgrounds.
Well, I think that's a very important question, which is that it's taken men so long to work out what the rules for interaction just between males should be, that of course when you bring gender into the equation, it makes everything far more complicated. And I'm reminded, of course, of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and suddenly we had a woman at the top of British politics, and she brought, a whole set of complications to the task in a way that hadn't been seen. I remember analysing Margaret Thatcher's non-verbal communication quite a while ago, and she was absolutely fascinating because she had a very distinctive non-verbal style and a very distinctive way of passing over the floor to people, and a very interesting intonational pattern. And it was a slightly confusing pattern because she came across as very authoritative, partly because when she was planning what she was going to say, she didn't use ums or ahs. People who and ah a lot sound very unsure of themselves. But the point about ums and ahs is it's a way of signaling, if you're pausing in speech, that you haven't finished talking. Mm. So we all and ah all the time. We just tend not to hear it. And what happened with Margaret Thatcher was, because she didn't or ah, but she had all these other intonational cues, people would try to interrupt her because they thought she'd finished. And then she would think, it's because I'm a woman they're trying to dominate me. So she then refused to give up the floor. And as a politician, as a female politician, her most famous distinctive characteristic was that she would talk simultaneously as interviewers for 4 or 5 seconds. Now that never occurs in political interviews or in real life conversations. And it was all because as a woman, she had to sound ultra authoritative. She got rid of all her ums and ahs, but instead of that, she was cueing in interviewers unconsciously. And then because they were interrupting her, she was trying to dominate them. So I think that gender does bring a whole set of other issues to bear on interactions that we haven't seen before. And I think Margaret Thatcher was a very fascinating case in point.
Well, Dr. Beattie, that leads me to my next question. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher, and she did indeed came across as a very authoritative figure, but on the other hand, I think she was also very feminine in many ways. I mean, she made a point of wearing a skirt rather than pants, and I think she also gave quite a lot of attention to her hairdo and to her makeup, to her bag. I mean, I remember reading in some memoirs that the men in the room were intimidated by her bags. Now, if we look at high-profile women in modern geopolitics, for example, Angela Merkel, Hillary Clinton, Christine Lagarde, they all sort of toned down that femininity by wearing pantsuits, by not wearing very bright makeup. And I wonder, since we've already discussed alpha males in politics, whether the rules would be different for alpha females.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because we don't normally, I mean, in the primate world, we don't have alpha females in the same way that we have alpha males, of course. But you're absolutely right, which is for a female politician, you can go down one of two routes. You can either try to emphasize the femininity, and Margaret Thatcher did that. And of course, famously, comments have been made about many of her cabinet liking her in that kind of way because of the way she looked and dressed. But of course, that brings up all kinds of interesting issues, which is if you want to be authoritative or more than authoritative, sometimes domineering, it's sending out a set of mixed signals to people, which is I'm feminine, don't attack, but I can attack you. So it does send some interesting signals to the recipients of that. Now, some other politicians don't go down that route at all. And in some sense, what they do is they adopt a much more kind of neutral, in terms of sexuality, stance. It's not like a toned down masculine look, but nevertheless, the femininity isn't the issue at the forefront of one's mind. And I think that they have to develop a different set of skills. I mean, the point is often made, of course, that in many aspects of life that women have to be more skilled than men to get to a certain point. And you can see that many of those female politicians have got those skills to a T. Better listening skills apart from anything else. And yet at the same time, they have to be persuasive or authoritative when required. So I think for a successful female politician, you require a kind of broader range of skills.
Now, Dr. Beattie, I know that you've been very passionate about psychology, and this field has grown exponentially in recent decades. I think it's been also quite actively applied to politics because leaders are being coached on how to use their body language, on how to be persuasive. There's profiling of foreign leaders to try to predict how they may react to certain events. And yet some may argue that politics, both domestically and internationally, is getting increasingly more dysfunctional. And I wonder if that's a result of too much psychology and psychological understanding, or too little, rather.
Well, personally, I think you can never have too much psychological understanding, but I do take the point that politicians are being tutored more and more about how they should behave. And of course, what that means is that you often end up in certain countries in which all of the politicians' non-verbal behaviour or body language looks identical. I'm thinking of the UK, for example, in which the leaders of the main parties all have very, very similar styles of body language. And I think that, in some sense, turns the electorate off because they can't see the real person beyond that. I mean, one thing that I'm particularly interested in is the gestural movements that people make when they talk. And those gestural movements are very interesting because they're a way of unconsciously representing what we've got in our mind. And, psychology shows that we're more likely to remember a political message when we see these gestures. They communicate certain core things. Now, what's really interesting, if you look at politicians who have been really tutored and taught to behave in certain ways, the gestural movements are all very similar, very repetitive, and it's almost as if they don't want their real thoughts to be shown to the electorate, as if they might be too frightening if people could read their minds.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I was just going to add that I think in terms of when we are discussing applying that to politicians and perhaps even global leaders, I think they represent a very interesting and very rare example, because on the one hand, they are individuals like all of us with our unique personalities, with their quirks, but on the other hand, they also have to represent the collective identity, the collective personality of their people. And I wonder which one of those are more difficult to understand and deal with. Because, I mean, taking the same examples that we discussed, Mr. Obama, Mr. Putin, I mean, they cannot afford to be themselves, I guess. They have to represent their countries. But, in the way they do that, it may play well with their domestic audiences, but it can sometimes work against them abroad due to those cultural misunderstandings.
No, I would agree with that, because I think that, of course, a politician has got a lifetime of learning to interact in particular ways, but also in terms of acquiring power, I think you'll learn skills of communication to go with that. And I think this business of representing the nation is a very, very important point. And it's not just representing kind of the core metaphors or values of the nation. I think at certain points you have to represent the aspirations of the nation. So this is where the power play comes in. You want to show that Russia or the US or wherever is the most powerful nation, the most dynamic nation. And I think that sets up particular challenges for some individuals. And I think that you can see that's why, in some sense, politicians rehearse handshakes so much. In that briefest of interactions between people, you can send a powerful message to another person. And I cannot watch politicians shaking hands without thinking an awful lot of thought is going into that. And yet, of course, it's the other bits of the nonverbal communication, the eye contact, the smiles and so on, which can be the most revealing, because they're the bits that in some sense are harder to practice, and they can be the bits that are truly revealing of the underlying disposition of the politician himself. So I think I think with politicians you get this odd, multi-layered communication dimension where I think you can read different things from different facets of the behavior.
Well, Dr. Bidi, unfortunately we have to leave it there, but I really thank you for this amazing and very interesting segment. And to our viewers, chime in with your views on our Twitter, Facebook and YouTube pages, and I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.